The Doodler. Is it still a cold case, or have there been recent developments? Stick around. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Sex Nerd Podcast / Just the Tip with Dr. Vic. My name is Dr. Victoria Hartman, and today we're going to, let me preface with, as you know, I've studied very interesting topics for about 25 years now, known as necrophilia, and mostly I studied people who have a kink within the BDSM framework. Recently, though, I've been more interested in serial killers and other kinds of true crime, and it's taken me in a direction where I'm now preparing a second book. And I've been made aware of some very interesting cases. And the reason they're interesting for what I'm doing is they generally involve a sexual element. And this particular case was brought to my attention by my social media coordinator at the Erotic Heritage Museum. So I thought I would dive into it because it has some very interesting implications, not just historically, but also in regard to the kind of things that are happening in our culture here in the United States today. So let's do a little bit of a retrospective of this particular case and see how it's impacted individuals in the LGBT community then and today, how that relates to today's issues around LGBT rights and legislation, and also if there seems to be some development in this case. Let's dive in. Now, the Doodler is an unidentified serial killer believed to be responsible for between 6 and 16 murders and 3 assaults of men in San Francisco, California, between January 1974 and September 1975. This is of particular interest to me because of forensic materials that I am currently investigating from that era in San Francisco, and the Doodler was sort of part of that umbrella. The nickname the Doodler was given due to the perpetrator's habit of sketching his victims prior to their sexual encounters and slayings by stabbings. The perpetrator met his victims at gay nightclubs, bars, and restaurants. Now, the police theorized at the time that the victims had all died after meeting with the suspect near the locations where the bodies were recovered. One might think that most of these victims, or all of these victims, were in fact gay men who were frequenting gay bars in the 1970s in San Francisco. However, that's not the case. Some of these individuals were married with children, had served in the military or worked for the government as a nurse, were Swedish American. One was a Swedish American immigrant, and they all met their end in a similar fashion. However, some of them, in particular Klaus Christmann, who was a German American immigrant, was discovered in 1974 on July 7th. His death had been somewhat more violent than the previous murders because he had considerably more stab wounds than the others and had been slashed in the throat several times. The body was fully clothed. Unlike the previous victims, he was married and had children. The fact that he had a makeup tube on his person when he died suggested to police that he may have been a closeted gay man. He remained identified briefly while police were investigating the cases, which they had believed were related after the third murder. One of the last victims, or in fact the last victim, who was known as John Doe number 81, was Harold Gullberg, 66, who was a Swedish American immigrant, and he was discovered on June 4th, 1975. His remains were slightly inconsistent than the other homicides because he was far older than the others. His underwear had been taken by his killer and his pants were unzipped. However, Goldberg is believed to have been the final confirmed victim of the Doodler. The Doodler wasn't completely successful at all of his attempted murders. 3 surviving victims refused to go forward with criminal investigations because they didn't want to out themselves. Among the survivors were a well-known entertainer and a diplomat. The suspect cooperated with police during his interview, but he never admitted guilt for the murders or the attacks. Now, this suspect was strongly believed to be the man in question who was responsible for these crimes, but he was never tried or convicted because the survivors' refusal to appear in court. To date, the suspect has not been publicly named or apprehended. Very little information is available to the public about these crimes. However, in February of 2019, police offered a $100,000 reward for information leading to the arrest of the killer and released a revised sketch showing that what he could look like 4 decades later. They later announced that they would consider forensic genetic genealogy, which identified a suspect in the Golden State Killer murders. Now, this is where I move into the social repercussions and challenges around LGBT issues. At the time, the activist Harvey Milk publicly expressed empathy for the victims who refused to speak with the police, stating, "I understand their position. I respect the pressure society has put on them." Milk elaborated that the 3 men likely feared damaging relationships with family and in the workforce, citing that he believed 20 to 25% of the 85,000 gay men in San Francisco were closeted about their sexualities. Now, this is a really great example, or a very tragic example, of what it means to be an LGBT person, or did back in the 1970s, as many of you know, still in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual that psychologists use to diagnose different disorders, that up until just a few decades ago, being gay or a lesbian was considered a mental disorder. And in the 70s, because there were really no LGBT rights as we know them today, which unfortunately are being reversed by various legislatures in various states, Florida being a great example, these individuals couldn't be out because they could lose their housing. They faced housing discrimination. They could lose their families. If they were married with children, they could lose those their nuclear family. So there were all kinds of challenges for individuals to be out about their sexuality. We see the same thing here in the United States, especially around sex work. Other than here in Nevada, sex work is illegal. And because it is illegal, sex workers often don't report crime because they're not protected, or they are targeted for worse crime than sexual assault. They're murdered, and those cases are swept under the rug because, well, they're a sex worker, they're in a violent situation, they should have expected that. And this is the thought of most police departments and so forth. Sex workers, they're disposable people. The same could be said about being an LGBT person in the 70s. You were disposable, you were mentally ill, you didn't matter. And we're seeing a lot of that manifest itself today in the recent swath of anti-LGBT laws that are being passed in legislatures all around the country, Florida being notable, Texas being notable, that they are rescinding the rights of LGBT people, which has consequences similar, or if not identical, to what happened in San Francisco with this crime spree. Now, in an article from January of this year, detectives in San Francisco released an updated age progression suspect sketch of the unsolved Doodler serial killer case in an attempt to revive their investigation. In January, it marked the 49th year of the anniversary of the Doodler homicides. Eventually, 6 victims would be found murdered on the Ocean Beach and Golden Gate Park area between 74 and 75. The suspected serial killer is known as the Doodler because one surviving victim said the killer was a cartoonist who doodled during their late night dinner. Also in this article, it states all of the Doodler's victims were men who were believed to be gay. And there is speculation that some surviving victims feared coming forward at the time because they didn't want their homosexuality or sex with men revealed. San Francisco Police Department states, we believe there are other persons who may have survived attacks by the same suspect or may have information regarding the suspect and these attacks. The San Francisco Police Department has increased the reward for information leading to the identification, apprehension, and conviction of the suspect from $200,000 to $250,000. They had already doubled the $100,000 award last year. There is no proof of this. It's only speculation and hearsay, but the high-profile entertainer that may have been a survivor of the Doodler is rumored to be Rock Hudson, who, of course, was at the time a closeted gay man just before the AIDS epidemic, about a decade before the AIDS epidemic, who, of course, he died of AIDS in the 80s, I believe. But he is one of the individuals who's rumored to be a surviving victim of the Doodler who didn't want to come forward at the time. So as you can see, and while I'm going to bring it forward to today, as we are navigating this very difficult time in this country around these anti-LGBT laws, these are the kinds of consequences that can happen. This is a great example of how anti-LGBT laws affect LGBT people and how they can be victims of violent crime who can never seek justice because they can't out themselves. And I think it's important to note that those of us in the public need to be more active in fighting these anti-LGBT laws. It's long been established in the sexological community that sexual orientation is innate, it's inborn, and to legislate away its existence creates conditions under which that individuals can be targeted and harmed because of their sexual orientation if they can't seek justice or seek assistance when they've survived a violent crime. I'm curious to see if this cold case is actually resolved by the San Francisco Police Department. And I think it's an important commentary on the importance of holding our legislative representatives accountable when they attack individuals for their sexual orientation. This is a great book if you want to dive a little bit more into laws and how they affect individuals around sex and sexuality and true crime or criminology. This is a really great book. I'm using this book as a reference for the work that I'm doing on my next book around serial killers and art. So you can get this. It's a little bit of an older book, but you can get this probably on Amazon or really anywhere books are sold. I highly recommend it. It really goes into the history of laws around sex and sexuality. And it's been a great resource for me. So on that note, thank you so much for joining me on this true crime episode of Sex Nerd Podcast. And if you want to add any information or suggestions for following episodes coming up in the future, just let me know and I will start doing my research. In the meantime, I want to say thank you to Carly for introducing me to this cold case, and I will see y'all next time right back here on Sex Nerd Podcast, Just a Tip with Dr. Vic.